Hello, everyone. Welcome to the University of Maine Cooperative Extension's Preserving the Maine Harvest webinar. I'm Lisa Fishman, and we will also be joined today by three other colleagues, Kathy Savoy, Laurie Bowen, and Kate Yerxa. Collectively, we have over 50 years delivering home food preservation workshops, and we are excited to be delivering our educational programming in this new format. These webinars are designed to provide you with current USDA recommendations for preserving food at home. Our weekly webinars feature foods in season corresponding with the Maine growing cycle. Today, we will focus on making fermented cucumber pickles. We'll share an overview of how the fermentation process works, tips for creating the highest quality fermented pickles, and how to troubleshoot anything that might. For some general housekeeping, we have our webinars set up so that you can hear and see us, but we cannot hear or see you. We will have time for questions throughout our presentation. You can ask a question by selecting the question and answer box at the bottom of your Zoom screen and typing your question into the box. Please use the Q&A feature and not the chat box. Thanks for joining us. Now let's get started. First, we're going to look at how fermentation preserves your food. Fermenting is a curing process that involves soaking vegetables in a brine for several weeks. Curing changes the color, flavor, and texture of the food. Fermentation produces lactic acid to help preserve the food. This acid is produced as the lactobacillus family of bacteria naturally present on vegetables convert the sugars in vegetables to lactic acid. This acid causes the pH of the brine to drop, making it harder for spoilage organisms such as mold, yeast, and bacteria to grow. So fermentation not only produces those characteristic pickled flavors we love, but it also creates a safe environment to preserve our food as well. So let's look at the ingredients that will be needed to brine your fermented cucumber pickles. When fermenting pickles, the brine is a mixture of salt, water, spices, and a small amount of vinegar just to prevent pathogens from forming. So let's talk about the salt. Canning and pickling salt is recommended for use in pickling, including fermenting, as it is a pure granulated salt. It does not have any of the additives like anti-caking agents or iodine that can cause your brine to turn cloudy or your pickles to darken. Iodine can also prevent the fermentation from occurring. Other salts, like sea salt and kosher salt, don't have additives either, but they can measure differently because of the crystal size, and that can result in an undersalted pickle. Not using the right amount of salt can be a safety concern, as salt plays an important role in fermentation. The salty solution helps to suppress the growth of unwanted pathogens before the bacteria produce enough lactic acid to keep pathogens from growing. So the correct amount of salt in your brine will prevent unwanted molds, yeasts, and bacteria from forming, which can ruin your batch of pickles. Also, don't use less salt or reduced sodium salt in your fermented pickles, as it may create an unsafe environment for fermenting food. If you add too much salt, it also can prevent any bacteria from growing, including the lactobacillus bacteria responsible for the fermentation. The next thing we're going to talk about is water. So hard water can give your pickles off colors and flavors. If you have hard water, you'll want to soften it before you use it by boiling it for 15 minutes and then letting it stand for 24 hours. If any mineral sediment develops at the bottom of the pot, you just want to pour off the water and leave the minerals behind. Chlorinated water can also prevent fermentation from occurring. So if you are on municipal water, you'll want to dechlorinate your water by letting the water stand for 24 hours before using it. The chlorine will evaporate out of the water and then it won't interfere with fermentation. Finally, vinegar. Why would you add vinegar? The USDA research-based tested fermented pickles recipe calls for the addition of a small amount of vinegar. The vinegar is not there to flavor your pickles, but rather to prevent pathogens from developing at the very beginning of the process, before there are sufficient levels of lactic acid produced by the bacteria. You want to make sure to look for 5% acidity on the label to ensure safety. Don't use homemade vinegars, as the acidity in homemade vinegars varies and may not create a safe final product. White vinegar is usually the default vinegar, as it is neutral in flavor, but you can use any kind of vinegar you'd like, just as long as it's 5% acidity. The last ingredient in the fermenting brine is spices. Spices are there for flavor, so they are safe to leave out or to substitute to your liking. You can get creative and add a mix of garlic, dill, or any spices from pickling spice mix, such as cinnamon sticks, bay leaves, chili peppers, peppercorns, yellow mustard seeds, fennel seeds, allspice, cloves, coriander, dill seeds, turmeric, and celery seeds. Typically, whole, dried, or fresh spices are recommended because ground spices can give your brine a cloudy look, which can be confused with signs of spoilage. Now let's talk about cucumber selection. So for best success, you want to choose smaller cucumbers that are about 3 to 5 inches in length. Larger cucumbers can be bitter or hollow and will end in poor quality pickles. You'll want to use a pickling cucumber variety like Kirby or Citadel, Premier, Bounty, Score, or Calypso. These cucumbers have thicker skins, less water in the flesh, and smaller seeds, which will give you a crunchier pickle. Non-pickling varieties are commonly labeled as European, English, salad, or slicing cucumbers, and they can result in soft pickles. One tip to help you maintain a crunch in your fermented pickles is to prepare your cucumbers properly by cutting the blossom ends off. And those are the ones that are circled right there in the picture. Be sure to remove a 1/16 inch slice from the blossom end of the fresh cucumbers. The blossoms contain an enzyme which causes excessive softening of the pickles. The blossom end is the one that's opposite the stem end. Simply slice this end off to ensure these enzymes don't cause your pickles to soften. If the stem is missing, look for the end of the pickle that's a lighter shade of green. That's the blossom end. Okay, we're going to launch a poll now, and we're going to test your knowledge. We'd like to know what type of salt is recommended to use in fermentation. Is it sea salt, table salt, pickling and canning salt, kosher salt, or pink Himalayan salt? I'm going to give you a few minutes to cast your votes, and then we'll look to see. Oh, excellent, excellent. And we're gonna end that poll, and we'll share the results of that with you now. And it looks like you were listening very well. Pickling and canning salt is indeed the best kind of salt to be using when you're making fermented pickles. That's the purest salt that doesn't have any of those caking agents or iodine. Excellent. Okay. We're gonna drop over now to see Lori, who's going to cover some of the equipment needed for fermenting your pickles. So, thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. So whatever size batch of pickles you want to prepare, it's important to make sure your container is of a food grade material. So whether that's plastic, glass, or ceramic, it should be designed to hold food. And for really large batches, you can use a plastic 5-gallon bucket. But don't think of heading to the garage for an old bucket that used to hold a joint compound or kitty litter. Rather get a food grade plastic bucket. And those are available from beer and wine brewing supply stores or your local deli or bakery. A good rule of thumb is that if the container originally stored food, it can be safely used for food again. And you can also look for the recycling symbol. It's a triangle with a number inside to determine what kind of plastic your container is. Plastics labeled 1, 2, 4, and 5 are typically made to contain food. We're going to include a resource about which plastics are safe for food storage in our follow-up, so you'll all be getting that. Now, ceramic crocks are available in different sizes as well. The one we have in our office holds a batch of sauerkraut made from 25 pounds of cabbage. And we call it the Cadillac of crocks because it has all the bells and whistles. It's finished with a food grade glaze. Some ceramic glazes contain heavy metals and aren't meant to come in contact with food. It also has a channel for water that creates an airlock when the lid is applied. This helps reduce air circulation over the fermented product while allowing for gases produced during fermentation to escape. And this reduces the chance that your pickles will spoil. Now for smaller batches, you could use a glass jar in a quart, half gallon or gallon size. After you've selected your container size, you'll need a weight, and that fits into your container. The weight will help keep your vegetables fully submerged under the brine during fermentation. This step is important because fermentation is an anaerobic process, which means it happens without oxygen. So your vegetables need to be fully submerged in the brine to properly ferment. Anything that is above the brine runs the risk of developing mold. Spores from the air may land on your vegetable. Okay, so let's take a break for questions. And let's see what we have.
Great, thank you so much. We actually don't have any questions at this time, but for those attendees, if questions do come up, we will have a few more times to answer your questions throughout this webinar. So now we are going to join Kathy in the demonstration kitchen.
Thanks, Kate. Today's recipe that we will be demonstrating is on your screen now. And this comes directly from the USDA Complete Guide for Home Canning. And what I've done is taken the recipe, which is originally in a gallon volume, and broken it down into a smaller unit that you may want to use at home, either a half gallon or a quart. And as you can see, all of the ingredients that are listed are the ones that we've been discussing prior to this demonstration. So welcome to the kitchen. We will be using our recipe today, which again was broken down from a gallon into a half gallon and even a quart size to make your own homemade batch of fermented pickles. My kitchen surface has been cleaned, as have my hands, so I'm ready to get started with today's recipe. The first thing that you want to do is select your cucumbers. And this morning I had an opportunity to head to our local farmer's market and select the cucumbers that I would be using for today's demonstration. And I've got some shown up here, and I actually bought this one, but do not intend to pickle it, as it is a larger variety of the pickling cuke type. The variety, the size that I selected, all fall into this 3-inch, 4-inch size, which really for me make a great size to accompany, your lunch and a sandwich. I also wanted to showcase this cucumber because you can clearly see that it still has the stem on it, and then that would leave us with the blossom end as the end that we want to prepare all of our cucumbers by slicing 1/16 of an inch off of. And I have in fact done that with the 4 pounds of cucumbers that I've purchased to make today's recipe of a gallon of pickles for fermenting. So I'm gonna move my other sizes out of the way here. And I have a clean glass jar, which does meet those requirements of a suitable jar for fermenting our cucumbers in. As I mentioned, I have already washed and removed the blossom end of these small pickling cukes that we will be using today. So to get started, I simply am putting in half of my spices, and I've got whole spices. Here you can see is a nice dill seed. So I'm putting half of that in the base of my jar, followed by the half of my pickling spices. And then I've got a whole dried pepper, as well as a garlic clove, and then some additional crushed red pepper. My family tends to like a little more heat to their kosher dill pickles. And then the next step is simply packing your jar with your prepared cucumbers. And this can take a little while. And there is no actual rhyme or reason to how you put them in the jar. You just want to pack them in there. I tend to have my bottom layer standing up straight and then put my next layer in on top of those, but sideways. It just tends to help create a little bit of pressure to keep the cucumbers submerged, which again is an important food safety step to fermenting your pickles. So there's about half of our pickles in the bottom. We're gonna fill up the jar with the rest of them. And again, this is a 4-pound volume of cucumbers, which is what the recipe calls for. So now that we've got our cucumbers in there, we go ahead and top it off with the rest of our spices. So this is the rest of the dill seed, the rest of the traditional pickling spice, and then the rest of the garlic and crushed red pepper. So the next step in filling our jar is to put the brine over the top of the cucumbers. I have prepared a brine ahead of time, and this is the brine as described in the recipe, which contains the water, and I used spring water, the vinegar, which I double checked to make sure is at the 5% acidity, which it is, and this is a distilled white vinegar, and then the salt that is sold exclusively for canning and pickling, which is what this is. Followed the volume requirements in my recipe for a gallon-sized jar and dissolved the canning salt in the brine. And so here is what we have for a volume. And I am pretty sure this could make a little bit of a mess as I'm pouring it in the jar. So hopefully we won't make too much of a mess. But let's see here. Oops. So as you can see, we are over the top of our pickles, but look, they do float. So we need to make sure and have some type of a weight in here that will help to keep our cucumbers under the brine. And again, that's not just because it looks better, it's because it is indeed a food safety step. So I oftentimes look around my kitchen, see what I may have that is a suitable weight. And what I have found in our demo kitchen is I wanted to be able to use one of our glass weights, but this is designed for a smaller type jar. So I found something else in our kitchen that I can simply push into the jar to keep the pickles submerged. And you may find at this point that you need to remove a pickle if you've kind of overfilled your jar, which I'm going to go ahead and do. And then that allows me to push this down into place. And again, this is not something that's designed for pickling, but it does serve the purpose of helping to keep those pickles underneath the brine solution. And then I simply put the weight in place to help hold those pickles, those cucumbers, which will ferment into being pickles, beneath the brine solution. And right now, hopefully you can see that I do have my water level up this high, and then my pickles are lower than that. And what I can then do is top off with an additional amount of brine to meet that requirement of having at least 2 inches of brine over the tops of my jars. I did make a little bit of mess, but not too bad. So now that I have my jar filled, my weight applied, I go ahead and cover the container with I use a coffee filter to keep any physical contaminants out of the jar. And go ahead and apply that. Coffee filter, rubber band, nothing super fancy, some things you have on hand in your kitchen. And then what's very important is to make sure that you label and date your jar. So I use just a Sharpie with a piece of masking tape and put the label on, and it simply says what's in the jar and what date I started it, so that I know when the time is going to be up for it to have completely fermented. But we don't just let it alone. You do need to watch your pickles as they're fermenting, because there can be obvious things that are sign of spoilage that you want to look out for. Before we talk about spoilage though, I want to talk about a jar of pickles. I want to show you an example of a fermented jar of pickles that and you can see how the color changes over time. This is a half-gallon size jar of over 3 weeks worth of fermented cucumbers. And so I just want to show you how easy this can be to do at home. So again, a half-gallon size, and you've got all the volume requirements for that. That'll be followed up in the recipe. But this again has been fermenting for 3 weeks. So it is again the coffee filter, rubber band, and then the weight that I use in this smaller size is again something I just have at home. And it is a small dish that fits down into the lid of this container and allows it to serve as a weight to push the pickles down into the brine. So this is something that I've been watching at home now for over 3 weeks, and I am careful to watch it to make sure it is not developing any signs of mold, any signs of bacteria, any signs of things turning slimy or anything like that. So it is in fact now a jar that is ready to have its lid applied and put into the refrigerator because it has fermented for over 3 weeks. So I want to talk about the conditions that you will now put your jar in to ferment. So really, it's an important part of being able to have the fermentation process occur is having your jar stored in the right condition. And the condition that matters most is the temperature. So if you have your jar at 55 degrees or lower, it will not ferment. It is not a temperature that's going to allow the lactic acid bacteria to be forming and doing all the things that it needs to do to ferment. 55 to 65 degrees will take a longer period of time for the fermentation to occur, but it can happen. These 70 to 75 degrees is the ideal temperature, and you will have fermentation occur within 3 to 4 weeks. Anything above 80 degrees is really too warm. And what you're going to find in that situation is that the pickles actually get softened and your jar may spoil. So prior to launching into making pickles, take some time to think about where in your home do you have the right temperature conditions to allow fermentation to occur. And I can speak personally of some failures that I've had as I've tried to ferment foods in an un-air conditioned or temperature controlled home in the month of July in Maine, where we have those beautiful 85-degree days, followed by a 65-degree day, followed by another 92-degree day. So those temperature variables can cause spoilage of your fermented process. So again, think ahead. Where do you have conditions in your home that can support that fermentation process? I now have an opportunity to ferment foods in a more controlled environment where we have heat pumps or AC. So that I have found lends itself to more success. As we talk about problems with fermented pickles, I encourage people to use their senses to identify if there is a problem in their jar. You can look to see if you have black spots perhaps developing on your cucumbers. That's a problem. You can look to see if you have strands, stringy things throughout your jar. That too can be a problem, as is any colorful molds that can occur. And you also want to use your sense of smell. Does the jar smell like a lovely jar of fermenting kosher dill pickles should smell? If you smell something else, if it's an off odor, you may need to get rid of that jar of pickles. We would recommend that you do get rid of that jar of pickles. Also, you can touch. You can find out if the pickles have developed a slime by touching the pickles or even the brine. That is another indicator that it's time to get rid of that jar of pickles. The fermentation conditions were not right, and it is a failure. I want to point out that something that is normal and is commonly seen on fermenting pickles is what's referred to as surface scum. Not necessarily the greatest word, but it does describe what can happen in pickles and what, again, is very normal. What you're seeing now is a picture of that surface scum on fermented pickles. And if you look carefully at that picture, in the center of the picture, you can see what looks like a opaque, kind of ghosty, pale, white patch. And that is, again, that very common, not a food safety risk, surface scum. So what do you need to do to get rid of it? You simply need to check your fermented product 2 to 3 times a week. I just use a regular tablespoon from my kitchen and dip it below the brine and get that surface scum off. And then keep checking it regularly and removing it if it is present. Hopefully the demo has given you the confidence to go ahead and start your own jar of fermented pickles at home. What we're going to do now is return to Lisa Fishman and talk more about how to store your pickles once you have had that successful 3 to 4 week fermentation process occur in those ideal conditions that we've talked about. Lisa?
Thank you, Kathy. And I wish I was in that demo kitchen right now so I could snack on one of those pickles you just got ready to put in the refrigerator. Once your pickles are fully fermented, they should be stored in the refrigerator and eaten within 4 to 6 months. Go ahead and enjoy them. They can be canned using a boiling water bath canner. This is considered an acidic product when it's fully fermented, so you could go ahead and process in a boiling water bath canner. An alternative to the boiling water bath canner is called low temperature pasteurization treatment. And this USDA approved method involves heating your pickles for a longer time at a lower temperature in order to maintain that crispness that you want in a pickle. Heat your water to between 180 and 185 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes. It's important to use a thermometer to monitor the water temperature if you do go this route, as a drop in the temperature below 180 degrees can mean the pickles are not properly processed and therefore would not be safe for long-term storage. Okay, we're going to do another poll right now. And we would like to know which one of these is not a sign of spoilage. Is it colorful molds, surface scum, black spots on your vegetables, slimy cucumbers, or unpleasant odor? I'm going to give you a few more seconds to get your votes in. I see numbers are climbing quickly on our poll. Another 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, and we're gonna share with you that you all tuned in on the fact that a little bit of that surface scum, although it's not the most pleasant of words, the surface scum really is kind of harmless. You just want to remove that with a spoon, like Kathy said. Keep your eye on your fermentation as it's happening, and remove that surface scum as you see it. And it's a harmless little thing that develops, and you're fine to go ahead and eat those pickles once the fermentation has stopped. Okay, so we are going to go back to Kate, who's watching the question and answer box, and I think we have quite a number of questions that have popped up. So we're gonna take off and let Kate ask some of those questions.
Thank you, Lisa. Yes, we've had several questions come in. The first couple questions we have revolve around covering the jar. Why wouldn't you just use a cover instead of the coffee filter? Would that cause the jar to explode?
Great question. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So what happens during fermentation is that there are gases that do form. So if you were to put a lid on your jar, you're absolutely right. It could form enough pressure to push that lid off of the jar. I've got something I want to show you as it relates to a quart-sized jar. Ball has put out a new product, which is a fermentation kit, which comes with a quart-sized jar, and this lovely spring-loaded weight that will keep your product pushed well down below the brine. And the cover looks like a regular cover, but what it has is a little bit of a air hole vent here, which allows that burping, if you will, to occur during the fermentation process. And our Cadillac crock that you saw earlier in a photo with the water lock seal around the top, when we have things fermenting in there, we can actually hear the fermenting that's occurring as those bubbles are released through the water. You'll hear a little bit of a burping sound. So again, yes, there are gases that can build up, and you want to have a way to release those so that the pressure doesn't build up.
Great, thank you. Another question was, could you use a clean towel instead of a coffee filter? What if you're fermenting in a 5-gallon bucket? So would that be appropriate?
Yes, and you may have noticed as we were talking more about storage of your pickles, that in addition to having a coffee filter on top of this wonderful jar of pickles, I did put a towel over the top as well. So that's another way to help keep it covered. And also the cover will drape over a little bit more and not allow as much sunlight into it. I also have a large 5-gallon bucket here, which, you know, this is kind of the super size for making homemade pickles. But if you were going to use this size container, you could, for a weight, use a regular size dinner plate and use that to keep, and again, I like to focus on things that people may have at their home to use. So here's a regular sized dinner plate that can fit right down in here and serve as a weight. And then remember to add more brine so that you've got the 2 inches of brine over the tops of the cucumbers. They do sell other types of weights, which were included in one of our photos. These are really nice because you can see through them and see what's happening. So I do like those. But yes, on a 5-gallon bucket, once you've got your weights in there, you could also just use a cloth as a covering as well.
Great, thank you. On the topic of weights, someone asked, could you use a plastic bag filled with water as a weight? And are there materials that you shouldn't use as weights, like metal?
Yeah, so anything that is not food grade would not be recommended. So the question had to do with, can you fill a plastic bag and use that as a weight? Yes, you can, as long as the plastic bag is food grade. And we also recommend that what you put in the bag to serve as a weight is some prepared brine, so that in the event that the bag leaks, you will have extra brine added to the contents of your jar, not water, which could then dilute your brine and create all sorts of problems with spoilage of your fermenting batch of pickles.
Great, thank you. We had a couple of questions around pickle crisp. Could you use pickle crisp in making your fermented pickles?
So we do not recommend using pickle crisp in a fermented pickle recipe. Pickle crisp, which is calcium chloride, is recommended for the quick pack processed variety of pickles. It is not recommended during fermentation. This is where I miss having our in-person classes, because I would love to be able to share one of these wonderful pickles with all of you so that you could experience the crunch that you do get from a lovely fermented pickle. So my colleague said that I should go ahead and crunch one of these as part of the video so that you could all at least get to hear it. So I'll prepare that and get ready for the crunch factor while Kate gives us the next question.
Sure. We have a couple of questions about the process. So is this a 2-step process? First, the fermentation, and then the question is about pasteurizing the jars, and that information that Lisa shared with us. Is that required?
So I will go out and say that if you're planning on storing your pickles for more than 4 to 6 weeks, is it 4 to 6 weeks in your refrigerator, or 6 months in your refrigerator, you want to make sure that you have them shelf stable, and then you do want to process either in the boiling water bath or the low pasteurization process. If you're just going to consume your pickles fairly quickly, if they were in my house, they would not be making it past barbecue season, then you can go ahead and just keep them stored in the refrigerator until they are gone.
Thank you. Do we have some time for a couple more questions? Okay. Someone is asking what to look for when considering purchasing a secondhand or a used crock. Some people have learned the hard way that there is a crack and they've lost some of the product that they made.
Yeah, so a crock. So a crock is different than the glass jars that I have here. Again, the glass jars are gonna let in sunlight, so you're gonna wanna have these. I always keep these in a darker corner of our demo kitchen. That works well. But the crocks are those earthenware style products. We had a picture in a slide earlier. And you want to make sure that the glaze that it has been finished with, that it is intended for use with food. Some from other countries are not food grade, so you really want to make sure that you are buying something that is intended to be used for food. I will also say that there are some crocks out there that come with a weight that is the heavy clay-based, but it hasn't been glazed, so they are porous. My experience with those has been that they create a little bit of a problem in the jar. They develop some black mold, they develop some spotting. So we've created a workaround for that with those porous, unglazed weights by simply putting them in a food grade Ziploc bag. That way they're protected, they're still serving in their role as a weight, and so that has been our effective workaround. But you do want to make sure and look at your ceramic pot to see if you can see any signs of cracks. I realize you may see a hairline crack in the glaze. That could eventually become problematic, even if it looks like a small hairline crack.
Great, thank you. Okay, we'll pause right now with the questions and we'll turn it back over to Lori, who's going to share some resources about how to locate local produce.
And then we'll have the crunch factor later.
Oh, sorry, yes.
I think the crunch factor is like one of the most important things. So we're going to make sure we squeeze that in.
Okay.
So to help you find local produce for pickling, our Maine agriculture colleagues have created a great interactive directory of Maine farm products so you can shop directly at farms. Just be sure to visit the farm's website or call first so you can learn about how their policies may have changed or have changed during COVID-19. And here's some information on our recommended resources. You'll get all these resources listed, included in the follow-up email. We have general information on fermenting as well as recipes for pickles, sauerkraut, and kimchi. Plus, we'll send along information on how to tell if your plastic container is food grade. We'll also include our recommended resources for preserving recipes from the National Center for Home Food Preservation and USDA and Ball. Now, we also want to tell you about our Preserving Coach program. This is an opportunity for Maine residents to be paired with a trained master food preserver volunteer for food preserving advice throughout the growing season. Master food preservers are trained in all aspects of home food preservation and then volunteer in their community teaching food preservation education. So if you're interested in being paired with a preserving coach, you can email Kate McCarty and she will set you up with a master food preserver that can provide advice by phone, email, or perhaps in person later in the year. We have many interested volunteers and only a few people have enrolled so far, so we have plenty of room in the program. So email Kate if you are a Maine resident and interested in a preserving coach. And don't forget to join us next week, Tuesday at 2. We're going to discuss preserving green beans. And other topics for July include freezing Maine seafood, and we'll have a special guest speaker. Look for that follow-up email from Kate McCarty with upcoming registrations, resources, and recipes from today's topic, and information on how to be paired with a preserving coach. And we'll have a link to Qualtrics evaluation and a certificate of completion if you complete our evaluation. You can also provide your US mailing address and we'll give you a free Headspace tool. So important for getting the headspace right on your preserved foods. So we have a couple of minutes left. So Kathy, if we can have the crunch factor.
I guess first, do we have any more questions?
We do have a lot of questions and they will be answered after the webinar as well if we don't get to them. But one question is about the scum. Do you check for it daily? Do you check for it weekly? What's the process?
So 2 to 3 times per week is what's the recommended time frame for checking for the scum. And as you can imagine, as the fermentation process is going on, you should be checking it more frequently. So I think it's an adventure to ferment pickles. So I probably look at mine more like 4 or 5 times a week.
Great, thank you. Do we want to go for the crunch factor?
Okay, so here it is. And I mean, as you can imagine, this pickle, it changes texture, it changes flavor during that 3-4 week ferment. But you still do have the lovely crunch. So here we go. Hopefully you can hear it. I am a distance away from the audio on my laptop. Did you get it?
We heard it.
Good. Well, Lori?
Oh, sorry about that. I was just going to admire the crunch in your pickle. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you all next week.